Hey, it's Matt. It's time for another installment of the Audience Podcast. Did you know that the Audience Podcast is brought to you by Castos, a fantastic podcast hosting and analytics platform? If you're a recurring listener or a new listener, I encourage you to not only share this show with others, but to learn more about starting or moving your podcast to us over at Castos.com. And hey, if you want to start a members-only podcast or a podcast just for your company employees, we're pretty good at that too. Today's episode is all about new podcast apps, plus Podcast 2.0. It's a big topic and a bleeding edge one for most of us. Suffice to say, this one episode wouldn't do the whole of it justice. However, if there's one thing I leave you with, it's that you're encouraged as podcast creators to go out and explore. If you've been hearing more and more about this from other shows you listen to but are still left scratching your head, well, allow me to illustrate it for you. Let's start with a clip from friend of the show, Evo Terror.
Apple, having dropped the ball since April 2021, is a gift. Anchor/Spotify making RSS feeds optional now is a gift. It's up to us, it's up to you and to me and the companies we pay to host our content to take advantage of that gift and push podcasting to the next level. So as I've said for years on this program, please spread this idea with other podcasters. Get them as excited about the future as you are.
If you want more of Evo's podcast pontifications, go to podcastpontifications.com. The podcast industry's perfect storm. I quote, treat their, Apple's, nonstop stumbling as a gift. That's what Evo just said in that clip you just heard. That's a thing I've been thinking about a lot lately. Let's face it, Apple's backing of podcasting in the early days helped make podcasting more mainstream. Lots of us wouldn't have jobs if Steve Jobs didn't take the stage showcasing the Podfather's first show.
So again, it's sort of like TiVo for radio for your iPod. And you just subscribe to these things, great. So let me show you what it's like. This is the next release of iTunes called Release 4.9, and I'm just going to run it right now. And what we can do is we go to the music store, and we can, this is not a live music, this is not the music store that's live for everybody else, it's a little private one for us here. And there's a little thing called podcasts right here, you click that, and we've got a page full of podcasts right here.
But the trillion-dollar brand has meandered along the last decade, barely giving us a working portal to submit our shows, let alone advance the industry. A feeling which is compounded during their updates to the platform earlier in the year, where podcasters were left scratching their heads, where's my show? Why aren't my episodes appearing? And why can't I submit a new podcast? Questions which still don't have answers. I know this because I see our support desk here at Castos, and Apple's lack of effort with transparency costs us time, money, and in some cases, customers. Suddenly, we all start looking around and begin to question, does Apple even care? As the all too familiar feeling of, oh God, another major platform failing creators starts to set in, out on the horizon, a ray of hope appears in the form of an open source movement called Podcast 2.0. I talked about this on previous episodes of Audience. If you follow me on youtube.com/Castos, you've seen me demo and explain some of the features which Castos will be adopting in the very near future. If you're seeking out who the real innovators are, aside from podcast hosting companies, look no further than Podcast 2.0 movement plus enhancements to the RSS namespace. If that sounds too technical for you, well, it kind of is, and that's a topic for a different episode. But just know that Podcast 2.0 efforts work to keep podcasting open, where the stark contrast of Spotify shutting down popular RSS feeds is the complete opposite. The fact of the matter is, when you combine the efforts of Podcast 2.0 movement along with new podcast listening apps, you start to unlock the real innovation happening in our space. But we can't have one without the other. As Podcast 2.0 continues to make strides, so must the podcast listening apps and hosting companies. We'll start with hosting companies first because that's who Castos is. Hosting companies must unlock features from the Podcast 2.0 namespace inside their software in order to pass those features to podcast listening apps, where they carry it the rest of the way. Apps can display things like funding information, hosting information, chapters, and even transcriptions. Think of it like Podcast 2.0 sets the blueprint, hosting companies run the plumbing, and listener apps have the nice fancy faucet and knobs that deliver us the water. It was the best thing I could come up with when I wrote this transcript. All for the better of the podcast listening experience. Oh, and then there's this thing called value for value. Yet another topic of monetizing podcasts through Bitcoin, which some apps support. And again, we'll save that for another day. See the YouTube channel because I covered a little bit of it over there as well. But let's recap where we're at. Apple gave us a huge advantage in podcast distribution and awareness nearly 2 decades ago. 1, thanks to their software. 2, thanks to the persistence of visionaries like Adam Curry.
Here's another. Adam Curry is one of the guys that invented podcasting. And he has a podcast called The Daily Source. Let me go ahead and subscribe to that. And we can go listen to his latest one. Just click on it.
Your daily source code, show number 180.
But after over a decade, the industry has become fragmented as massive players try to own an ecosystem powered by passionate creators and an open web standard. That's RSS. Apple rolls out a new update that highlights how brittle podcasting is and how little they care about podcasts. Thanks to the efforts of Podcast 2.0, they've clashed with the failures of Apple and others who've neglected podcasting to create the perfect storm. Many notable podcasters realize this, and it's time to look for alternatives because big platforms aren't helping us. Can we get to podcast apps now? Yeah, but I said this episode was about podcast apps, but I'm not going to highlight or give you a definitive list, sorta, kinda. As podcasters, we have to come together and recognize first that our call to action for years, subscribe to us on Apple, Spotify, and Google, needs to be thrown out. In fact, many of us have because Apple changed it to follow instead of subscribe. But the proof is in the podcasting pudding. So before I recommend what apps or where to find them, if you're a podcast creator, change your call to action to tell your audience where to listen to your show. Change starts with us, and a near 20-year habit is going to be hard to break. I'll give you my early take on which apps to explore, which ones to look at least look more promising to me, and maybe once you start to dig in, you can find the apps that you really like. First things first, go to newpodcastapps.com. It's the best place to start your research and start experimenting. I'll be upfront and honest right now. The biggest challenge I have with these apps is they aren't smooth, they aren't feature-rich, and they aren't sexy. It'll be challenging to pull Pocket Casts out of my cold, dead podcasting hands. However, there are some that are interesting from a certain use case that I can picture myself using, at least in one-off environments. Fountain is a new app that lots of people are talking about. I think because of its Boostagram feature and how it makes the whole value for value paying with Satoshis a breeze. If you laughed at the word Satoshis, that's okay. The rest of us are still too. CurioCaster looks great as a web-based listening experience with lots of the Podcast 2.0 features. I know the guys over the Podcast 2.0 podcast talk about it a lot. Sphinx Chat, which I covered on the YouTube channel, has a fairly straightforward way of setting up your Bitcoin payments and integrating a layer of live chat to podcasts, which I find really interesting. And AntennaPod seems like a really promising open source podcast app for Android users. So it's conclusion time. If you feel a bit overwhelmed, you're in the right place. I am too. As creators, we need to play our part in helping advance the industry too. Well, let me restate that. As creators, we advance the industry too. We shouldn't throw our hands up and just give it to the billion-dollar companies competing with trillion-dollar companies like Apple. When has that story ever played out well for any of us? Give yourself some breathing room, spend some time with these new apps, see what works and what doesn't. Give the creator of the app some feedback, maybe promote podcastindex.org or by all means your own website before you push Apple or Spotify. If you need to set up a website for your podcast, Castos makes that really easy with our WordPress plugin and special templates with Elementor. Send us an email if you want more information about that. That's it for today's episode. If you enjoyed it, do me a favor. Search for us on podchaser.com and leave us a review. Tweet at us at CastosHQ. Tell my boss Craig I'm doing a decent job. All right. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you in the next episode.
Your channel, Infinity, Sirius, NPR are all doing podcasts now, BBC.
And these are all free?
These are all free. Newsweek is doing podcasts. Business Week is doing them. Forbes is doing them. Washington Post, Denver Post, Seattle Post are doing podcasts. Philadelphia Daily News, San Francisco Chronicle. Disney, when they wanted to get the word out on their 50th anniversary, did a podcast. It's pretty amazing.
And you have this subscribe, unsubscribe.
That's
buttons. Could they? I presume they could be used if you were to eventually get into selling paid audio stuff.
Well, you could try to sell podcasts, but the whole phenomenon is so great it's free. Okay. And I think what we're going to see is an advertising-supported model emerge, just like free radio. And again, I have a feeling
this is exciting stuff. I have to tell you.
Well, I bet you'll be podcasting your column in the not too distant future.
I need more work.